April 25, 1945. The small village of Heidenheim, southern Germany. Private First Class Thomas Harrington of the United States Army, 79th Infantry Division, trudged through the muddy streets as a light spring rain fell across the devastated landscape. From nearby hills, the distant rumble of artillery echoed, the death throes of a conflict nearing its inevitable conclusion. What Harrington believed would be another routine patrol through recently captured territory would, within 24 hours, become one of the most extraordinary encounters of the European campaign, changing the lives of over 100 men. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a single act of compassion toward one starving child unwittingly triggered a chain reaction that would reveal how quickly the facade of ideological certainty could collapse when confronted with the fundamental truth of human decency. The spring of 1945 marked the final months of the conflict in Europe. The Allied forces were advancing steadily across German territory from both east and west. The once mighty German war machine was disintegrating under the relentless pressure of superior Allied industrial capacity and manpower. Production statistics told the story more eloquently than any propaganda. By 1944, American factories alone were producing 200,000 aircraft per year, compared to Germany's dwindling output of 36,000. American tank production reached nearly 90,000 units for the year, while German production struggled to achieve 18,000. For Private Thomas Harrington, a 23-year-old former schoolteacher from Wilmington, Delaware, these statistics were merely distant numbers. His reality consisted of cold rations, wet socks, and the constant vigilance required in territory that, while nominally secured, still harbored pockets of resistance. The 79th Division, nicknamed the Cross of Lorraine for their distinctive insignia, had landed at Utah Beach 12 days after D-Day and fought their way across France through the Rhineland and now into the German heartland. "Keep your eyes open, Harrington," Sergeant Miller warned, as their 5-man patrol moved through the village. "Just because headquarters says this area is secure doesn't mean some desperate holdout won't take a shot at you." "Yes, Sergeant," Harrington replied, though his attention had already been drawn elsewhere. In the doorway of a partially collapsed building, a small figure huddled against the rain, a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, watching them with hollow eyes. Captain Robert Williams, commanding officer of Company B, 31st Regiment, had briefed them extensively on interaction protocol with German civilians. "Remember, men," Williams had emphasized, his weathered face serious beneath his helmet, "these people have been told for years that we're monsters coming to destroy their homes and families. Every interaction you have is a chance to prove that propaganda wrong." Despite these instructions, most soldiers maintained a wary distance from the local population. Too many had seen comrades fall to booby traps or civilian-disguised combatants to take unnecessary risks. But something about this particular child caught Harrington's attention. "Hold up," he called to Corporal Jenkins, who was leading the patrol. "Give me a minute," Jenkins frowned. "We're supposed to maintain formation, Harrington." "Just 1 minute," Harrington insisted, already breaking away toward the building. The child, a boy with unkempt blonde hair and clothes that hung from his thin frame, tensed as Harrington approached, ready to flee. Military intelligence reports had indicated severe food shortages throughout Germany, with civilian rations cut to less than 1,000 calories per day in many regions. The evidence of this policy was visible in the boy's gaunt face. "It's okay," Harrington said softly, knowing the words themselves meant nothing to the German child, but hoping his tone would convey his intentions. He reached into his field pack and withdrew his ration box. American combat rations, while often derided by the troops who consumed them day after day, contained over 3,000 calories, 3 times what German civilians were receiving. The child watched with wary eyes as Harrington opened the box and extended a chocolate bar toward him. At headquarters, Major General Ira Weitchie had emphasized the strategic importance of winning civilian trust, but for Harrington, this moment transcended strategy. He saw not an enemy civilian, but simply a hungry child. For several long seconds, the boy remained frozen, his gaze shifting between Harrington's face and the offered food. Then, With the swift movement of one accustomed to sudden disappointments, he snatched the chocolate and retreated deeper into the doorway. "We need to move," Jenkins called impatiently. Harrington hesitated, then placed the remainder of his rations, a can of meat, crackers and powdered coffee, on a dry spot near the doorway before rejoining his patrol. "You shouldn't waste your food on them," Private Wilson commented as they continued through the village. "They've got their own relief systems." Harrington shook his head. Did that kid look like he was being relieved of anything? What Harrington could not know was that his simple act had been observed by more than just his fellow soldiers. From a partially destroyed second-floor window across the narrow street, Oberst Wilhelm Kessler, a 47-year-old career officer of the German army, had witnessed the entire exchange. Kessler commanded what remained of the 97th Infantry Regiment, a once proud unit reduced to approximately 300 combat-effective personnel. As the Western Allies advanced from one side and the Soviet forces from the other, Kessler had been wrestling with an increasingly impossible situation. His orders from high command were clear: fight to the last man. Reality, however, presented a different imperative. That evening, as Harrington's patrol returned to their temporary headquarters in what had once been the village schoolhouse, Oberst Kessler called together his remaining officers in the cellar of a partially damaged church 3 kilometers outside Heidenheim. "Gentlemen," Kessler began, addressing the 12 officers gathered in the dim light of kerosene lamps, "our situation has become untenable. We have ammunition for perhaps 2 days of moderate engagement. Our fuel reserves are effectively non-existent. Most critically, our food supplies will be exhausted by tomorrow evening." Major Heinrich Brandt, Kessler's second-in-command, and a decorated veteran of both the Eastern Front and North African campaign, leaned forward. "The orders from command are absolute, Herr Oberst. We are to defend this position regardless of supply status." Kessler nodded grimly. "I am aware of our orders, Major Brandt. I am also aware that continuing to follow them means the certain demise of every man under our command, with no strategic benefit to show for their sacrifice." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. What Kessler was suggesting bordered on treason under the military code they had sworn to uphold. Yet the reality of their situation was undeniable. "This morning," Kessler continued, "I observed an American soldier share his rations with a local child, Heinrich Müller's son, I believe. This soldier gained nothing from this action. It served no strategic purpose. Yet he did it without hesitation." Lieutenant Werner Schmidt, the youngest of the assembled officers at 24, spoke up. "With respect, Herr Oberst, a single act of kindness does not erase the threat these forces pose." "You misunderstand me, Lieutenant," Kessler replied. "I am not suggesting the Americans are without fault or that all their actions are humanitarian. I am merely noting that this incident, combined with reports from other captured areas, suggests that surrender to Western Allied forces may not result in the treatment we have been led to expect." Throughout the war, German propaganda had painted a horrific picture of what would happen to those who surrendered to enemy forces, particularly those who fell into Soviet hands. While the Eastern Front reality often matched or exceeded these warnings, reports from the Western Front told a different story. Prisoners taken by American and British forces were generally treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, housed in proper facilities, provided adequate food and protected from reprisals. The discussion continued late into the night. Major Brandt remained steadfast in his opposition to surrender, citing both their military oath and the potential consequences for their families under the regime's policy of Sippenhaft, collective punishment extended to relatives of those deemed traitors. Others, including Captain Friedrich Weber, who had served as a liaison with American forces before the war, argued that surrender was now the only responsible course of action. "Our men deserve the chance to see their families again," Weber argued passionately. "Continuing this fight serves no one, not Germany, not our soldiers, not even our honor." As the debate raged, Oberst Kessler remained silent, weighing not just the immediate tactical situation, but the moral dimension of his command responsibility. Shortly before midnight, he made his decision. "We will approach the American lines tomorrow," he announced, silencing the ongoing debate. Not as combatants, but to discuss terms of surrender. Back at the American position, Private Harrington sat on his cot, writing in the journal he had maintained since landing in France. Unlike many soldiers who recorded only major engagements or memorable events, Harrington documented the small moments, conversations with French farmers, the architectural details of damaged churches, and interactions with local children. "Encountered a German boy today," he wrote by flashlight. "Couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. Gave him my chocolate ration and some other food. Reminded me of my nephew back home. Strange to think how easily our positions could have been reversed if I had been born here and he in Delaware. Same hungry child, just different flags flying overhead." Sergeant Miller passed by, noticed Harrington's writing, and paused. "You're still keeping that diary? What are you going to do with all those pages when you get home?" Harrington shrugged. "Maybe nothing. Maybe I'll use them when I go back to teaching. Help the kids understand that history isn't just dates and famous battles. It's people trying to live through extraordinary circumstances." Miller nodded thoughtfully. "Well, don't stay up too late. Captain wants extra patrols tomorrow. Intelligence reports increased movement in the area." The intelligence was correct, though not in the way American command anticipated. At dawn, Oberst Kessler assembled his officers, 97 in total, ranging from fresh-faced lieutenants to battle-hardened majors. Many had removed their insignia of rank, fearing identification by Allied intelligence services. Others wore their decorations openly, perhaps as a final statement of pride in their service, if not in the cause it had come to represent. "Each of you has made your decision," Kessler addressed them. "Those who wish to continue fighting are free to do so, though I cannot offer you leadership or resources in that endeavor. Those who have chosen to accompany me will proceed as discussed. We will carry no weapons. We will approach with white flags visible. We will comply with all instructions given by American personnel." 3 officers had declined to surrender, slipping away during the night to attempt to reach other German units still actively engaged. The remaining 97 stood ready to follow Kessler into an uncertain future as prisoners of war. At the American position, the day began with routine patrols and perimeter maintenance. Captain Williams received reports of civilian movement on the western approach to the village, but thought little of it initially. Refugee movements were common as fighting shifted across the region. Private Harrington had drawn sentry duty at the western checkpoint, a sandbagged position at the village edge, manned by 4 soldiers with a .30 caliber machine gun and field telephone connection to headquarters. At approximately 9:15 in the morning, he noticed an unusual procession approaching along the main road. "Sergeant," he called to Sergeant Frank Delaney, the position commander. "You need to see this." Delaney raised his binoculars and focused on the approaching column. "Dear God," he muttered, then grabbed the field telephone. "Captain, this is West Checkpoint. We have approximately 100 individuals approaching. Appear to be German military officers. No visible weapons, multiple white flags. Request instructions. Over." Captain Williams's response was immediate and emphatic. "Maintain position. Do not fire unless fired upon. I'm sending reinforcements. Keep them at distance until I arrive. Over." Within minutes, the checkpoint's personnel had doubled, with 2 additional machine guns positioned to cover the approaching Germans. Captain Williams arrived shortly thereafter, accompanied by Lieutenant James Harper, the company's intelligence officer. Through his binoculars, Williams observed the column's leader, a tall, distinguished man with the bearing of senior command, though no visible insignia. "Have they made any aggressive movements?" he asked Sergeant Delaney. "No, sir. They've maintained steady approach. No flanking maneuvers. No attempts to scatter or take cover." Williams nodded. "Harper, your assessment." Lieutenant Harper studied the approaching group carefully. "Definitely officers, sir. Their bearing, boots, and quality of uniforms give them away, even without insignia. I'd estimate ranks from lieutenant to colonel. This isn't a typical surrender scenario. We usually get enlisted men or mixed units. An all-officer group of this size is unprecedented." Williams made his decision. "Harrington, you speak some German, correct?" "Yes, sir. Not fluent, but enough to communicate basics." "You're with me. Sergeant Delaney, maintain position here with half the men. Lieutenant Harper, bring the other half and follow us at 20 yards. No itchy trigger fingers, understood. But stay alert. This could still be a trap." As Williams, Harrington, and two other soldiers moved forward to meet the approaching Germans, Oberst Kessler halted his column and stepped forward alone. For a moment, the two groups stood silently assessing each other across 30 yards of rain-soaked road. "Ich bin Oberst Wilhelm Kessler," the German officer called out in a clear, controlled voice. "Ich möchte mit Ihrem kommandierenden Offizier sprechen." Harrington translated. "He says he's Colonel Wilhelm Kessler and wants to speak with our commanding officer." Williams stepped forward. "I am Captain Robert Williams, United States Army. I have authority to accept surrender but not to negotiate terms. Any surrender must be unconditional." When Harrington translated this, Kessler nodded. "Wir verstehen und akzeptieren diese Bedingungen. We understand and accept these conditions." What followed was one of the most unusual surrender proceedings of the European campaign. As American reinforcements arrived and established a secure perimeter, Oberst Kessler formally surrendered his sidearm, the only weapon he carried, to Captain Williams. Each of the 97 German officers then provided their name, rank, and unit designation to Lieutenant Harper, who documented each surrender with growing amazement. "Sir," Harper reported to Williams after completing the initial processing, "we've got 3 full colonels, 17 lieutenant colonels, 26 majors, and 51 captains and lieutenants. This represents the command structure of what would be approximately 3,000 to 5,000 troops. Yet none of them can or will tell me where those troops are currently located." Williams frowned. "Are you suggesting they've abandoned their men to save themselves? That doesn't align with German officer behavior we've observed elsewhere." "No, sir," Harper replied. "Based on their equipment condition and what limited information they've provided, I believe their units have been effectively destroyed through combat attrition. These officers likely command units that exist mostly on paper at this point." As the processing continued, Oberst Kessler requested permission to speak privately with Captain Williams. With Harrington present as translator and 2 guards watching closely, Williams agreed to this unusual request. "Captain," Kessler began, speaking slowly to accommodate Harrington's limited German, "I wish to explain why we have surrendered in this manner." Williams nodded for him to continue. "Yesterday, one of your soldiers gave food to a German child in Heidenheim village. I witnessed this act. This soldier gained nothing strategically from this kindness, yet he did not hesitate." Kessler paused, seeming to carefully consider his next words. "For years, we have been told that American soldiers would destroy our homes, abuse our people, and eliminate our culture. This simple act of compassion made me question everything we have been told about our enemies," Harrington translated, suddenly realizing that Kessler was describing his own interaction with the boy in the doorway. Kessler continued, "I discussed this observation with my officers. Many had heard similar reports from other areas under American control: fair treatment of prisoners, respectful interaction with civilians, even food distribution to local populations. We compared these reports to our orders to continue fighting until total destruction, and we made our choice." Williams listened intently, his expression revealing nothing. When Kessler finished, Williams was silent for several moments before responding. "Colonel, I appreciate your explanation, but I must be clear. We would have accepted your surrender regardless of your motivation. Our policy is to process all prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, provide medical care as needed, and eventually repatriate you when hostilities conclude. Your personal reasons for surrender, while interesting, don't change our procedures." When this was translated, Kessler smiled slightly. "That response, Captain, further confirms we made the correct decision." As the German officers were being processed for transport to a rear area prisoner facility, Private Harrington approached Captain Williams. "Sir, may I ask what will happen to them now?" Williams glanced toward the Germans being loaded onto transport trucks. "They'll be moved to a processing center, then to a permanent POW camp, probably in France or possibly England. Eventually, they'll be repatriated once peace terms are established." Harrington nodded. "Colonel Kessler mentioned a soldier giving food to a German child. That was me, sir, yesterday, during patrol." Williams studied Harrington carefully. "Did you report that interaction in your patrol debrief?" "Yes, sir, it's in Sergeant Jenkins's report." "Well, Private, it appears your small act of kindness may have helped bring this group in peacefully, potentially saving lives on both sides." Good work. Williams paused. Though I wouldn't recommend making a habit of giving away your rations, supply chains stretched thin enough as it is. Yes, sir, understood. As Harrington turned to rejoin his unit, he noticed a small figure watching from behind a damaged wall, the same boy from the previous day. Their eyes met briefly before the child disappeared into the ruins of Heidenheim. The surrender of Kessler's officers would later be documented in the 79th Division's operational reports as a significant intelligence coup, providing valuable information about German unit dispositions, morale, and command structures in the region. What the official reports did not capture, however, was the human dimension of the event. How a simple act of compassion had catalyzed a decision that likely saved hundreds of lives on both sides. 1 week after the surrender, as the 79th Division prepared to move eastward, Private Harrington returned to the spot where he had first encountered the German boy. The village was now under formal military government administration, with food distribution centers established in the former town hall. Harrington had no real expectation of finding the child again, but felt compelled to check. To his surprise, he found not the boy but a middle-aged woman waiting near the partially collapsed building. When she saw Harrington, she approached cautiously. "American soldier?" she asked in heavily accented English. Harrington nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She pressed a small object into his hand, a carved wooden figure of a soldier. "Mein Sohn," she said, pointing to the carving, then to Harrington. "Danke." Before he could respond, she hurried away, disappearing into a side street. Harrington examined the rough carving, clearly made by a child's inexperienced hands, but recognizable as a soldier offering something to a smaller figure. "Found a souvenir?" Sergeant Miller asked, approaching from behind. Harrington carefully tucked the carving into his pocket. "Something like that." The significance of Kessler's surrender extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Major General Weitsch, commanding the 79th Division, recognized the potential intelligence value of having so many senior officers voluntarily surrender. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel Howard Matthews, Division Intelligence Officer, to conduct extensive debriefings. What makes this group particularly valuable, Matthews noted in his report to 6th Army Group Headquarters, is their willingness to cooperate fully. Unlike many captured officers who provide only name, rank, and serial number, these individuals are volunteering detailed information about unit strengths, disposition, and morale throughout their sector. The intelligence gained proved instrumental in subsequent operations. Based on information provided by Major Friedrich Weber, American forces were able to locate and secure 3 ammunition depots and a fuel storage facility without casualties. Captain Hans Schmidt's detailed knowledge of defensive positions along the Neckar River allowed for precision artillery targeting that neutralized these positions while minimizing civilian casualties in nearby communities. Perhaps most significantly, the psychological impact of nearly 100 German officers surrendering en masse had a profound ripple effect. When word spread to other German units in the region, as Kessler had anticipated it would, surrender rates increased dramatically. Division records indicate that in the 2 weeks following Kessler's surrender, over 2,000 German military personnel surrendered to 79th Division units, often citing knowledge of the officers' fair treatment as a motivating factor. For Thomas Harrington, however, the wider strategic implications remained abstract. His war continued with daily patrols, occasional skirmishes with die-hard resistance, and the constant task of helping to restore basic services in occupied areas. He kept the wooden carving, eventually attaching it to his dog tags with a piece of wire. In his journal, he reflected, "Strange to think that giving away a chocolate bar might have influenced the surrender of 100 officers. Captain says I shouldn't get a big head about it. They were probably going to surrender anyway, given their situation. Still, it makes you wonder how many lives might be saved by small acts of decency, even in the midst of all this." 3 days later, Harrington's unit was involved in clearing operations near Stuttgart when they encountered unexpected resistance from a group of teenage Hitler Youth members armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. In the brief but intense engagement that followed, Harrington was wounded by shrapnel, sustaining injuries to his right leg and abdomen. At the field hospital, surgeons worked for 4 hours to remove metal fragments and repair damaged tissue. Though his wounds were not life-threatening, they were severe enough to end his combat service. As he recovered in the hospital ward, he received an unexpected visitor, Captain Williams. "How are you holding up, Harrington?" Williams asked, settling into the chair beside the hospital bed. "Doctors say I'll keep the leg, sir. Won't be running any races, but I should walk normally eventually." Williams nodded. "Good news. Listen, I thought you might be interested in this." He handed Harrington a folded document. "It's a translated copy of Colonel Kessler's formal statement to intelligence. He specifically mentioned you, or rather, the American soldier who gave food to a child. Says that single act was the catalyst for his decision to approach us, rather than continue fighting or attempt to reach other German units." Harrington read through the document with growing amazement. Kessler had provided a detailed account of his decision-making process, including the debate among his officers and his own moral reasoning. "Did this really make that much difference, sir?" Harrington asked, handing the document back. Williams considered the question carefully. "War is complex, Private. Would Kessler and his men eventually have surrendered anyway?" "Probably. The strategic situation was untenable for them. But might they have fought for another week or two first? Also probable, and how many more casualties would that have caused on both sides? That's impossible to calculate." He leaned forward slightly. "What I can tell you is this. Throughout history, wars are remembered for their big moments, major battles, famous speeches, dramatic victories and defeats. But for the people who actually fight them, wars are experienced as thousands of small moments, moments of fear, courage, cruelty, and yes, sometimes unexpected kindness. Your moment with that child was one of those small moments that rippled outward in ways you couldn't have anticipated." When Harrington was eventually evacuated to a hospital in France and then to England, he carried with him not just the physical wounds of combat, but a profound understanding of how individual actions could transcend the impersonal machinery of war. On May 7th, 1945, as Harrington convalesced in a military hospital near London, news arrived of Germany's unconditional surrender. The celebrations in the streets of London were visible from his hospital window, crowds cheering, flags waving, impromptu parades forming spontaneously through major thoroughfares. In the hospital ward, the reaction was more subdued. For men who had experienced the conflict firsthand, victory brought relief, but also reflection on the cost paid to achieve it. For Harrington, thoughts turned to the carved wooden figure still attached to his dog tags and the child who had made it. "You planning to go back after the war?" asked Corporal Michael Donovan, recovering in the next bed from wounds received near Munich. "Back where?" Harrington asked. "To Germany, to find that kid or the colonel who surrendered because of you. Seems like the kind of story you'd want to follow up on." Harrington shook his head. "They probably wouldn't even remember me. Besides, one chocolate bar didn't win the war." "Maybe not," Donovan replied. "But it might have ended the war for those 100 men and whatever troops they still commanded. That's something." In the years following the conflict, the story of Kessler's surrender became something of a legend within the 79th Division, retold, embellished, and eventually documented in the division's unofficial history. The official military records were more circumspect, noting simply, "Significant enemy officer cadre surrendered to elements of the 315th Infantry Regiment on April 26, 1945, providing valuable intelligence that facilitated subsequent operations." Thomas Harrington returned to civilian life in October 1945, resuming his teaching position at Wilmington Central High School. True to his wartime reflection, he incorporated his experiences into his history classes, emphasizing to students that major historical events were often influenced by countless individual decisions and actions that never made headlines. In 1954, Harrington received an unexpected letter with a German postmark. Inside was a brief note written in careful, formal English. "Dear Mr. Harrington, my name is Karl Müller. You may not remember me, but in April 1945, when I was 8 years old, you gave me chocolate and food in Heidenheim when I was very hungry. My mother later gave you a carving I made. Colonel Kessler, who surrendered to your unit partly because of your kindness to me, was my uncle. He survived the war and often told me the story of how one American soldier's compassion influenced his decision to surrender his command. I am now 17, and preparing to study medicine at university. I hope to one day help others as you helped me. With deepest gratitude, Karl Müller. Enclosed with the letter was a photograph of a teenage boy standing beside an older man in civilian clothes, presumably Karl and his uncle, the former Colonel Kessler. Harrington wrote back immediately, beginning a correspondence that would continue for decades. In 1968, 23 years after their brief encounter in a war-torn village, Thomas Harrington traveled to Germany as part of an educational exchange program. In Munich, he finally met Karl Müller again, now a practicing physician, and Wilhelm Kessler, by then in his 70s, but still possessing the commanding presence Harrington remembered from the surrender. "You know," Kessler remarked during their meeting, "for years after the war, I questioned whether I had made the right decision, surrendering my command rather than fighting to the bitter end as we had been ordered. But when I see what has been rebuilt from the ashes of that conflict, when I see my nephew helping heal the sick rather than lying in a grave for a lost cause, I know it was right." Harrington, who had carried the small wooden carving with him on his journey, returned it to Karl. "I think this belongs to you. It's traveled with me since 1945. Karl examined the crude carving with wonder. "I barely remember making this. I was so hungry then that everything from that time is a blur, except for the American soldier who gave me food when everyone else just walked past." The meeting of these three men, connected by a momentary interaction amid the chaos of war, was documented in several newspapers as an example of reconciliation and the enduring impact of humanitarian acts, even in the darkest circumstances. Wilhelm Kessler died in 1973, but Karl Müller and Thomas Harrington maintained their friendship until Harrington's death in 1997. Karl attended the funeral in Wilmington, placing a small carved wooden soldier on the casket before it was lowered into the ground, a final tribute to the man whose simple act of kindness had altered the trajectory of so many lives. In the official military histories of World War II, the surrender of Kessler's officers appears as merely one of thousands of such events that occurred during the final collapse of German resistance. Statistical analyses focus on the tonnage of supplies delivered, numbers of casualties inflicted, ground gained, and strategic objectives achieved. These metrics, while necessary for understanding the conflict's scope, fail to capture what might be called the human calculus of war, how individual moments of decision, often made instinctively rather than strategically, can resonate through time in ways no military planner could predict. Production figures tell us that by 1945, American factories were producing one aircraft every 5 minutes, one tank every 30 minutes, and one ship every day. German manufacturing, despite Albert Speer's efforts to maximize efficiency, could not approach these numbers. Yet production statistics alone cannot explain why 100 German officers chose to surrender to a much smaller American force, rather than continue a fight they might have prolonged for days or weeks. For that explanation, we must look not to the grand strategies conceived in distant headquarters, but to the ground-level reality of a hungry child, a compassionate soldier, and an observant officer who recognized in that small interaction a truth more compelling than the ideological certainties he had been taught to uphold. In his final letter to Karl Müller, written just months before his death, Thomas Harrington reflected, "When people ask me about heroism in war, they expect stories of dramatic rescues under fire or last stands against overwhelming odds. I've known men who performed such actions, and their courage deserves every recognition it receives. But I've always believed there is another kind of courage, the courage to maintain one's humanity when everything around you encourages its abandonment. Sometimes that courage looks as simple as sharing food with a hungry child, or as complex as leading 100 men to surrender, when continuation of fighting would only add names to casualty lists without changing the war's outcome." Today, in the town of Heidenheim, a small memorial stands near where the surrender took place. The inscription in German and English reads simply, "At this site on April 26, 1945, compassion triumphed over conflict when 97 German officers laid down their arms after witnessing a single act of kindness. May we remember that even in our darkest hours, humanity's light is never fully extinguished." The story of Private Harrington and Colonel Kessler reminds us that history is shaped not just by grand forces and famous figures, but by countless individual choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. In a conflict that claimed millions of lives and destroyed countless communities, their encounter represents a moment when the cycle of destruction paused, however briefly, and a different path was chosen. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.